The ballroom smelled like burnt coffee and polished ego. 200 employees sat at round tables beneath rented chandeliers, staring at a 12-foot projection screen that read, Strategic Acceleration Initiative. I was seated in the front row, where I'd sat for every quarterly town hall for the past decade. Close enough to see the numbers, close enough to correct them if they were wrong. Evan Calloway took the stage like he was accepting an award. We're streamlining legacy weight, he said. Pacing slowly, starting with her. He pointed. At me. A few nervous laughs fluttered and died. No one moved. 24 years of operational drag. He continued. It's time for modernization. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? What's the temperature where you are? Drop it in the comments. And if stories about quiet power and underestimated people resonate with you, consider subscribing not just for me, but because every share helps these lessons reach someone who might need them. My name is Maris Dean, Senior Vice President of Operations. I built 3 of our 5 plants from empty land and red ink. I cut logistics costs by 18% in 5 years. In 2009, when we were staring at an $80 million loss and creditors were lining up, I restructured our supplier contracts in 72 hours and kept this company breathing. I'm the only person here who understands every link in our supply chain without looking at a slide. Evan is 29, MBA, never ran a shift, never negotiated a raw materials contract at midnight. His title, Chief Transformation Officer, exists because his mother signed an internal memo. No HR review is necessary, he said brightly. We're moving fast. Security was already walking toward me. No warning, no board vote, no performance issue, badge. He said. I stood. 200 pairs of eyes followed me. Understood. I replied. Gasps. Whispers. Someone muttered. This is insane. Evan smiled like he'd just won something. Escort her out. I handed over my badge without breaking eye contact. Calm unsettles insecure men. He mistook it for defeat. As security guided me toward the exit, I pulled out my phone and sent one message. Activate Article 9. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Evan thought he had just eliminated dead weight. He didn't realize he had just fired the majority owner of his company. What happened after that public dismissal was just the opening act, and the real story is only just beginning. Some of the details that follow will be dramatized, aided by artificial intelligence to sharpen the message and deepen the emotional experience. I hope you relax tonight. Listen with a calm mind, and then sleep soundly. Now, let's continue. The humiliation didn't end when security walked me out. It multiplied. By 9 the next morning, HR sent a company-wide email Maris Dean has chosen to pursue other opportunities. Chosen, as if I had casually decided to abandon 24 years between lunch meetings. My phone buzzed nonstop, confused texts from plant managers. A stunned voicemail from procurement. I didn't respond. I read the severance packet instead. 3 months' salary. No performance bonus. No accelerated vesting on unvested shares. Clean and clinical. Like I had been a short-term contractor instead of the backbone of operations. In 2008, when revenue collapsed, and we were staring at insolvency, I volunteered to cut my own salary by 30% to avoid layoffs. In 2015, I negotiated a $400 million supply agreement that locked in pricing for 7 years and stabilized margins. In 2020, when the pandemic froze half the country, I lived at the primary plant for 3 weeks, sleeping in my office to keep production running safely. I signed hazard pay approvals at 2 in the morning. I kept the furnaces lit. Everything was denied, erased. I seemed motionless, allowing the insults I had heard to slowly settle into a colder emotion. By noon, Evan was on CNBC. We're modernizing, he said smoothly. No more outdated thinking. Outdated. That was the word he chose for institutional memory and crisis management. The market rewarded him for it. By closing bell, our stock was up 3% on the strategic restructuring announcement. Analysts praised bold leadership. Commentators used phrases like generational shift and agile future. I watched the ticker crawl upward and felt something tighten behind my ribs. Humiliation has a shelf life. After a point, it condenses into calculation. At 4:17 that afternoon, my attorney filed a document with the SEC. The confirmation email arrived 6 minutes later. Subject line: Majority Shareholder Governance Notice filed. The market had moved 3%. The governance structure was about to move much more than that. Cold control is quieter than revenge. It doesn't shout, it files paperwork. For 24 years. While I was running plants and negotiating freight contracts, I was also buying ownership. It started with the employee stock purchase plan, 15% discount, automatic payroll deductions, quarterly reinvestment of bonuses. Most executives took the cash. I took the equity. Every quarter, every year, no drama, no announcement. Then came the private blocks. In 2012, Martin Keller, our retiring head of procurement, wanted liquidity for a lake house in Michigan. He held a modest but meaningful percentage. I bought it through a properly structured agreement. In 2016, Denise Howard, our longtime CFO, stepped down and quietly sold her shares. I purchased those as well. Through a legal trust my attorney had formed years earlier, everything disclosed, every Form 4 filed, every Schedule 13D amendment submitted on time. Ownership accumulation isn't exciting, it's arithmetic and patience. The trust structure kept the filings clean and transparent, but consolidated. By the time I crossed 5%, then 10, then 20, the disclosures were public record. Anyone could have checked. No one did. The board hadn't reviewed consolidated ownership filings in 9 years. Institutional complacency is a remarkable anesthetic. By the end of last quarter, I owned 58% of the company, at our current valuation of $2.2 billion. That stake represented just over $1.27 billion in equity value. Majority control, not theoretical, legal, documented. The SEC filing my attorney submitted the afternoon after my termination wasn't emotional. It cited corporate charter provisions, voting thresholds, and governance requirements. It referenced the unilateral action taken against a majority shareholder without written consent. It attached 24 years of clean documentation. At 7:42 that evening, our general counsel, Thomas Avery, opened the filing. He called my attorney first. "Tell me this isn't accurate." He said, "It's precise." My attorney replied. Thomas accessed the SEC database himself. He reviewed the historical filings. He printed them. 43 pages. Cross-referenced acquisitions. Verified beneficial ownership. By page 12, he stopped highlighting. By page 29, he stopped breathing evenly. He called the board chair. An emergency meeting was scheduled within 48 hours. As required under the corporate charter when majority governance rights are invoked. Notices went out to all 9 directors. Legal review began immediately. My termination. The compensation adjustment. The authority of the executive who signed it. Everything was now under scrutiny. I did nothing publicly. No statement, no interviews, no social media correction. Cold control requires silence. Meanwhile, Evan had no idea. At 11:53 that night, he posted on Instagram a photo from his new corner office, my former office, champagne glass on the desk, city skyline behind him, caption "New Era Begins." By midnight. The image had been captured, archived, and attached as an appendix to the governance notice. Symbolism matters in litigation. The next morning, the board received a formal memorandum outlining 3 immediate questions. First, whether Evan's title had ever been ratified by full board vote. Second, whether he possessed authority to terminate or demote a majority shareholder. Third, whether his actions constituted a material governance breach, exposing the company to liability. Market analysts still believed this was a bold restructuring story. The stock held its gains inside the company. The tone shifted. Directors who hadn't spoken to me in months were now reviewing documents from a decade ago. The general counsel requested archived board minutes. Compliance officers reopened dormant governance files. Cold control spreads quietly. At 10:15 the following day, my attorney called. They're convening in 48 hours. Full attendance confirmed. I looked out at the manufacturing district skyline from my kitchen window. The same buildings I had helped expand. The same supply routes I had optimized. The same company I had steadily purchased, share by share. While others chased titles, Evan was still celebrating a 3% bump. He hadn't realized he had just terminated the majority owner of his own corporation. And within 48 hours, he was going to learn exactly what that meant. Waiting is a discipline. Predators don't rush. They let the room come to them. 47 hours after my attorney filed the governance notice, I walked into conference room A, not as a terminated executive, but as majority shareholder. The nameplate in front of my seat read exactly that. Clean, engraved, impossible to ignore. 9 directors were already seated. Thomas Avery, our general counsel, had a stack of documents arranged with surgical precision. The air felt heavier than usual. Not loud, not chaotic, just compressed. Anticipation does that to people who realize they may have missed something fundamental. Evan walked in last. He glanced at the nameplate, then at me, and smiled as if I had shown up to argue about a parking ticket. "This is procedural noise," he said, dropping into his chair. "We can clear this up in 10 minutes. I didn't respond. Hunters don't announce intent. Thomas stood. "This emergency session has been convened pursuant to Article 9 of the Corporate Charter." Paper shifted. No one interrupted him. He continued, "Article 9 states that no officer of this corporation may alter the title, compensation, or duties of any individual holding a majority of issued shares without prior written consent from that shareholder." Silence expanded across the table. Evan leaned back. "That clause was drafted decades ago. It's obsolete. It is active," Thomas replied evenly. "And enforceable." Thomas began outlining the timeline: my termination, the compensation adjustment, the lack of written consent, the absence of board consultation. Each point landed without drama, which made it heavier. I watched the directors instead of Evan. 2 were rereading the charter excerpts. 1 had removed her glasses and was staring at the valuation sheet attached to the filing. 58% ownership, $2.2 billion valuation. Control isn't theoretical when the math is printed in black ink. Evan cleared his throat. "Even if that's technically accurate, I acted within my authority as Chief Transformation Officer." There it was. The hinge. Thomas paused. "Which brings us to the second matter." He slid a separate folder across the table. "The authority of the Chief Transformation Officer." Board minutes from the past 3 years were displayed on the screen. Resolution approvals, compensation packages, committee votes, governance amendments. No formal vote ratifying Evan's title. No recorded resolution granting restructuring authority. The position had been created through an internal executive memo signed by the former CEO, his mother, but never subjected to full board approval as required under the bylaws for new C-suite roles. One director spoke first. "Are you saying the position was never formally authorized?" Thomas didn't blink. "There is no record of ratification." Evan straightened. "My mother approved it. With respect," Thomas replied. "Board approval is not the same as executive preference." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not anger, not apology, but structural exposure. Predators survive on imbalance. Governance corrects imbalance. The board chair cleared her throat. "We need clarity. Is the Chief Transformation Officer position legally recognized under our charter?" Thomas answered without embellishment. "Not without formal vote," which did not occur. Evan's jaw tightened. "This is absurd. You're derailing modernization over a technicality." I finally spoke. "It isn't a technicality," I said calmly. "It's ownership." Every pair of eyes shifted to me. "You terminated a majority shareholder without consent," I continued, "under a title that does not legally exist." No one interrupted. Thomas moved to the formal motion. The board must now determine whether the actions taken under the unratified title were authorized and enforceable. Votes would be cast on 2 questions first. whether Evan's position had been validly established. Second, whether his termination of me had standing under corporate law. Evan laughed once, short and sharp. "You're all overreacting." No one laughed with him. The directors requested a closed deliberation. Evan was asked to step outside while they reviewed the documentation. He hesitated, then complied, his confidence thinning but not gone. As the door closed behind him, I folded my hands and waited. Predators understand stillness. 15 minutes later, the board reconvened. The first vote addressed the title. 9 ballots. 9 against ratification. Unanimous. The Chief Transformation Officer position had never existed in legal terms. Evan was called back into the room. He entered expecting negotiation. Instead, he faced a board that had just erased his authority on paper. He looked at me then, not smiling this time. This was no longer procedural noise. This was structural collapse. If you can feel the power shifting, drop a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think, because every opinion adds weight to the truth we're uncovering together. Power doesn't explode, it tilts. When Evan walked back into the boardroom, he still carried himself like a man expecting negotiation. He didn't yet understand that authority had already shifted in the 15 minutes he'd been outside. The board chair, his mother, kept her hands folded on the table. She didn't look at him. Thomas Avery spoke first. "The board has completed its review. No preamble, no cushioning, on the matter of the unratified title. The vote is unanimous. The role of Chief Transformation Officer is not recognized under the corporate charter." Evan exhaled sharply. "Fine. Then we fix the paperwork." Thomas didn't blink. "We are not finished." The second vote concerned his unilateral termination of a majority shareholder. 1 by 1. Directors stated their positions aloud. 8 voices, measured, controlled, against. The final vote belonged to the chair. She paused long enough for the air to thin. "Against," she said quietly. 8 to 1. The only vote in Evan's favor was his own, entered into the record before he understood the outcome. Thomas continued. "The board therefore rules the termination of Maristine null and void, effective immediately." "I didn't move. Further," he added, "given the governance breach and exposure risk created by these actions, the board has voted to remove Evan Calloway from any executive capacity, effective immediately." Evan stood so fast, his chair rolled backward. "You can't do this!" he snapped. "My mother..." She didn't speak. He turned toward her. "Mom." Her expression was composed, but the distance was unmistakable. "This is a board decision," she said finally, "not a family discussion. Security was notified. Thomas wasn't finished. In order to stabilize operations and restore investor confidence," he said, "the board has voted to reinstate Maristine to her prior position and appoint her interim chief executive officer pending formal confirmation." There it was, the axis completing its rotation. For a moment, no one looked at me. They looked at the numbers: market capitalization, voting percentages, governance risk exposure, the language of power. Evan laughed once. "Brittle. You're handing the company to someone who just filed against it." I met his eyes for the first time since he'd fired me. "I didn't file against the company." I said evenly, "I filed to protect it." Silence answered that. Thomas slid a folder toward me. "Interim authority documentation. Signature lines. Effective immediately." Power doesn't feel loud when you've prepared for it. It feels inevitable. Evan was escorted out without another word from his mother. The door closed with a soft click that carried more finality than any raised voice could have. But the shift didn't end there. Within hours of the board's internal decision, compliance officers drafted a disclosure statement outlining corrective governance measures. It wasn't optional. When majority shareholder rights are invoked and executive authority is invalidated, transparency becomes mandatory. By late afternoon, word had reached several institutional investors. At 6:30 that evening, Thomas forwarded me an email chain marked urgent. 3 minority shareholder groups had formally requested documentation regarding what they termed nepotism governance risk. They wanted to know how an unratified executive position had been allowed to exercise restructuring authority over a publicly valued corporation. One fund held 4%, another held 2%. Combined, they represented enough influence to trigger external review if dissatisfied. The irony wasn't lost on me. Evan had framed my experience as legacy weight. Now the market was examining whether family privilege had created systemic risk. The next morning, financial analysts revised their notes. Language shifted from bold restructuring to governance oversight concerns. The 3% bump that followed my firing began to flatten. Power doesn't just change hands, it recalibrates scrutiny. Thomas called at 9:15. "They're considering forming an independent committee," he said, "specifically to examine nepotism exposure." "Good," I replied. "Good," he repeated. "If the system is going to work," I said, "it has to work all the way." He was quiet for a second. "You're not angry." "I'm focused." That was the difference. Evan had mistaken spectacle for control. The board had mistaken silence for absence. Minority shareholders had mistaken stability for governance health. Now every layer was awake, and for the first time since I handed over my badge, the company wasn't reacting to ego. It was responding to ownership. Legal warfare doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with paper. 3 days after the board removed Evan and reinstated me as interim CEO, the first formal complaint arrived. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was structured, itemized, and aimed directly at him. A coalition of minority shareholders filed suit against Evan Callaway in his personal capacity, not the company, him. The allegations were precise, unauthorized restructuring, material shareholder damage, and governance breach resulting from actions taken under an unratified executive title. The estimated exposure was $120 million, calculated from temporary market distortion, compliance remediation costs, and reputational harm triggered by his unilateral termination of a majority shareholder. The complaint cited internal communications, public statements, and board minutes. It argued that his conduct created foreseeable governance risk and compromised fiduciary stability. Lawyers don't use adjectives when numbers are enough. Evan's legal team responded within hours, calling the suit opportunistic overreach. They claimed the board's corrective action had already neutralized any material damage. They framed it as an internal misunderstanding, amplified by activist investors. But markets remember headlines. Institutional analysts revised their risk outlook again. Governance vulnerability became a recurring phrase. Insurance carriers began reviewing directors' and officers' coverage clauses. That review alone signaled concern. From my office again, I monitored the filings without commentary. My role now required separation. The company would cooperate with investigators. I would not interfere. Then the SEC announced a preliminary inquiry. It wasn't a raid. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. A request for documentation regarding executive authority, disclosure timing, and potential material misstatements to investors. Whenever the SEC uses the word potential, markets translate it as expensive. Thomas Avery called me at 7:40 in the morning. "They've opened an investigation," he said. "Preliminary, but formal. Expected." I replied. He hesitated. "They're requesting internal correspondence from the restructuring week. Provide everything," I said. "Transparency is armor when you've done nothing wrong." By midday, Evan's attorneys shifted tone. They issued a statement emphasizing cooperation and reiterating that he had acted in good faith to modernize operations. Good faith is difficult to prove when documentation exists. The escalation came 48 hours later, during document production. Compliance officers uncovered an internal email thread from 2 weeks before my termination. It had been archived, but not deleted. Evan had written to a consultant and a junior executive. "We'll phase her out before anyone checks filings." The sentence was casual, almost flippant, followed by a winking emoji. It was time-stamped. The room was quiet when Thomas read it aloud to me. "Intent matters in governance disputes. Premeditation shifts narrative from strategic decision to calculated maneuver. By late afternoon, that email had been appended to the minority shareholders' amended complaint. It reframed the argument, no longer a rushed executive judgment, but evidence suggesting awareness of ownership filings and a decision to act before scrutiny. Evan's attorneys immediately contested interpretation, claiming the message was taken out of context. They argued it referred to performance filings, not ownership, but context is shaped by sequence. He had terminated a majority shareholder under an unratified title, without board consent, then posted about a new era. The market reacted quietly this time. Our stock dipped 2.6% over the next trading session. Not a crash, just erosion. Investors don't panic when governance stabilizes. They adjust when uncertainty lingers. Insurance carriers issued reservation of rights notices regarding Evan's personal coverage. If the court determined willful misconduct, the policy could decline defense costs. That possibility altered negotiations overnight. Evan called once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. This is getting out of control. No, I thought. It's getting examined. The SEC formally confirmed its investigation at 4:23 that Friday. Subpoenas were authorized for additional communications, including consultant contracts tied to the restructuring initiative. Power shifts are visible. Legal consequences are methodical. As I signed compliance authorizations from behind the CEO desk, I felt no triumph, only alignment. Governance isn't revenge, it's correction. Evan had believed authority was inherited. Now he was learning it is documented. And documentation, unlike ego, doesn't blink. Reputations don't collapse in flames. They erode in headlines. The first major outlet ran the story at 8:12 in the morning. CEO's son fired majority shareholder before governance vote. By noon, 3 financial networks had picked it up. By close of business, it was trending across executive leadership forums. The narrative was simple, which made it powerful. A young executive, appointed by his mother, had terminated the majority owner of a $2.2 billion company without board authorization. The corrective vote, the lawsuit, the SEC inquiry, it read less like corporate strategy and more like cautionary case study. From my office, I watched the coverage accumulate. I didn't issue rebuttals. I didn't offer commentary. Silence can be strategic when the facts are speaking clearly enough. Evan tried to respond. He posted a statement on LinkedIn calling the reports misleading and contextually distorted. Within minutes, the comment section filled. Governance professionals, former colleagues, anonymous analysts, questions about authority, questions about documentation, questions about the email that had surfaced. By the end of the day, comments were disabled. 2 days later, the post itself disappeared. That's when the private consequences began surfacing. A leadership advisory firm that had previously floated Evan's name for a technology turnaround role quietly withdrew its interest. I learned that through a call from a mutual contact who said, carefully, they're concerned about optics. Optics, the polite word for credibility damage. Recruiters don't say liability, they say timing. The market adjusted again, not violently, just steadily. Analysts began referencing governance reform as a stabilizing factor. They mentioned my interim appointment as a corrective measure. They referred to Evan in the past tense. Meanwhile, the SEC inquiry remained active. That detail alone changed how the story was framed. Media doesn't ignore regulatory scrutiny. Then the real shift came. At 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, Thomas walked into my office without knocking. He closed the door before speaking. One of our institutional backers is reconsidering its position. Which one, I asked. Northbridge Capital. They held a significant equity stake. More importantly, they had committed $300 million toward our expansion financing over the next 18 months. What's their concern, I asked. Though I already understood. Continued association, he said. Specifically, whether Evan maintains any formal or informal influence. The message was clear. If Evan remained connected in any capacity, advisory or symbolic, the commitment would be withdrawn. Within hours, Northbridge sent a formal letter. The language was precise governance. Stability was a prerequisite for capital allocation. Any ambiguity regarding leadership risk would trigger reassessment. Reputation doesn't collapse because of one mistake. It collapses when trust recalculates. Evan issued another statement through counsel denying wrongdoing and emphasizing his removal from executive authority. It didn't matter. The story had moved beyond denial. Board members began receiving inquiries from other investors seeking assurance that no additional undisclosed governance issues existed. Due diligence intensified. Internal audits expanded. At 7 that evening, I received a message from an industry colleague. This will be taught in MBA programs. He meant it as observation. It sounded like obituary. The following morning, Northbridge formally paused its $300 million commitment pending completion of the SEC investigation and final resolution of the shareholder lawsuit. Paused is another polite word. I informed the board immediately. Transparency again. Always. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Evan had justified my termination as modernization. Now, modernization required proving distance from him. Image is currency in corporate leadership, once devalued. It's difficult to reprice. As the week closed, financial publications ran follow-up pieces analyzing governance failures and generational entitlement in executive succession. Evan's photograph appeared beside phrases like cautionary tale and structural oversight. He had once believed perception could be managed. Now perception was managing him. And capital, as always, was watching. Consequences eventually convert into numbers. 2 weeks after the governance vote, the board approved a corrective financial measure designed to stabilize investor confidence and signal operational continuity. We announced a special dividend of $60 million, funded through retained earnings and adjusted capital reserves. The message to the market was clear. The company remained profitable, liquid, and structurally intact. Ownership percentages determined distribution, with my 58% stake. My portion of that dividend totaled $34.8 million. The funds were transferred into the trust account within 48 hours of declaration. Clean, legal, documented. I didn't celebrate. The dividend wasn't a reward. It was a recalibration tool. Minority shareholders received their portion proportionally. The board framed it as a gesture of accountability and stability after a period of governance disruption. Meanwhile, Evan's financial reality began shifting in the opposite direction. The minority shareholder lawsuit seeking $120 million in damages moved into discovery. Legal fees escalated quickly. His attorneys formally notified the company's directors and officers' insurance carrier, requesting defense cost coverage under his prior executive status. Initially, the carrier responded with a standard reservation of rights letter. Translation coverage possible. Subject to review. But coverage under D&O policies is conditional. It protects officers acting within authorized scope. It does not shield willful misconduct or actions taken outside granted authority. That distinction became critical. As part of the ongoing SEC inquiry and civil litigation, documentation was submitted showing that Evan had acted under a title never ratified by board resolution. Authority, in legal terms, must be explicit. His legal team argued that functional authority existed regardless of formal ratification. They framed it as a procedural oversight, not intentional overreach. Insurance carriers, however, operate on contract language, not optimism. 3 days later, the carrier issued a supplemental letter. Preliminary determination coverage for defense costs would be suspended pending final adjudication regarding scope of authority. If a court determined that Evan knowingly exercised powers beyond his legally recognized position, indemnification could be denied entirely. The board reviewed the letter in executive session. I attended as interim CEO, not adversary. Financial aftershock rarely feels dramatic in the room. It feels technical, cold. But technical language carries enormous weight when liability attaches personally. Evan's attorneys filed objections. insisting that coverage should remain intact until final judgment. They argued that denying defense funding at this stage created undue hardship. The carrier responded by citing specific policy clauses excluding coverage for acts performed without lawful authorization, unauthorized restructuring, governance breach, material misrepresentation risk, words that once felt abstract now translated into personal exposure. By the end of the week, Evan was financing portions of his legal defense privately while awaiting further determination. Industry contacts began quietly distancing themselves. Advisory invitations stopped. Panels went silent. I signed dividend confirmations and investor communications while reviewing updated cash flow projections for next quarter's expansion budget. The company remained solvent. Operational metrics held steady. Production output exceeded forecast by 2%. Stability contrasts sharply with personal liability. Late Friday afternoon, Thomas entered my office again. The carrier has formally denied advancement of defense costs until the authority question is resolved, he said. On what basis, I asked. Though I already knew. Exceeding granted executive powers. There it was. Insurance exists to manage risk. It does not protect overreach. I nodded once. Then the process continues. Outside my office window, trucks moved steadily through the loading yard. Operations never pause for governance drama. They respond to structure. Evan had once believed his position insulated him from consequence. Now consequence was itemized, invoiced, and potentially uninsured. Financial aftershock doesn't roar. It settles in balance sheets. And sometimes, it stays there. Stability isn't restored with announcements. It's restored with removal. Once the financial aftershock settled into projections and court calendars, I turned inward toward the company itself. Governance had been corrected at the top, but culture lingers long after titles disappear. If this was going to hold, it had to be cleaned thoroughly. The first move was operational. I reinstated the original plant leadership structure that had been quietly sidelined during Evan's modernization initiative. 3 senior operations managers who had been reassigned to advisory roles were brought back into direct command. They understood throughput variance, supplier fragility, and human morale things no slide deck measures properly. I called each of them personally, no theatrics. I said, just restore what works. They didn't ask about compensation. They asked about authority. That told me everything I needed to know. Next, I addressed what I privately called consultant culture. Over the past year, 6 external advisory firms had been contracted under Evan's initiative strategy accelerators, branding specialists, digital repositioning architects. Collectively, their fees exceeded $12 million. Their output consisted primarily of rebranded terminology and aggressive timelines disconnected from operational capacity. We reviewed every active contract. 4 were terminated within 10 days under performance clauses. 1 was scaled back to limited compliance advisory. 1, ironically, resigned after public scrutiny intensified. The savings weren't symbolic. They redirected capital back into equipment modernization that had been postponed in favor of optics. Then came transparency. I instructed compliance and legal teams to draft a governance clarity report, not a press release, a full disclosure document outlining executive authority structures, board ratification processes, shareholder rights, and internal approval protocols. 32 pages. We published it publicly. Investors appreciate numbers. They trust documentation. The report acknowledged the structural oversight that had allowed an unratified executive position to function unchecked. It outlined corrective measures, mandatory board votes for all C-suite roles, quarterly ownership review protocols, independent governance audits, and a new anti-nepotism provision requiring conflict of interest disclosures for familial executive appointments. The language was firm without being defensive. Internally, morale shifted. When operations teams see structure restored, they exhale. Production variance dropped by 1.3% within a month. Overtime normalized. Voluntary turnover slowed. Clean systems produce predictable outcomes. Externally, Analysts revised their commentary again. The narrative transitioned from governance crisis to governance reform. Capital prefers correction over chaos. Then the unexpected final piece moved. Margaret Calloway requested a private meeting. She entered my office without the composure she once carried so easily. For years, she had balanced executive presence with maternal loyalty. That equilibrium had fractured. "I misjudged the pace," she said quietly. "This wasn't about pace." I replied. She nodded once. 2 days later, the board received her formal resignation. No press conference, no public statement, just a signed letter citing the need for independent governance renewal and avoidance of perceived conflicts of interest. Her 4.2% stake remained intact. Ownership doesn't evaporate, but influence does. The board accepted her resignation unanimously when the announcement was released. Market response was muted but positive. Institutional investors value visible accountability. Internally, it felt like the final filter-clearing sediment from water. I didn't celebrate her departure, but I recognized its significance. Governance correction had reached its logical conclusion. Authority had been redefined. Culture had been recalibrated. Transparency had replaced assumption. Later that evening, I walked through the primary plant unannounced. Machines ran steady. Supervisors conducted shift briefings without tension in their shoulders. The rhythm felt familiar again. Cleaning up isn't glamorous, it's procedural, deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. When I returned to my office, I looked at the updated organizational chart pinned to the wall. Clear reporting lines, ratified roles, no ambiguous titles. Power had shifted weeks ago. Now the structure matched it. And for the first time since the town hall, the company felt like it belonged to its shareholders again, not to a surname. That is what real cleanup looks like. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in my office, late on a Tuesday afternoon, after most of the staff had gone home. Evan didn't knock. He stepped inside like he still belonged there. Though his access badge had been deactivated weeks earlier, security had cleared the visit in advance. I allowed it. Some endings require eye contact. He looked thinner, sharper around the edges. The confidence wasn't gone, but it was cracked. "You sat there like you lost," he said without greeting. "At the town hall." "You didn't fight." I closed the folder I'd been reviewing and leaned back in my chair. "I don't lose." I replied evenly. "I accumulate." His jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like he might argue that line. Instead, he exhaled. "This has gone too far," he said. "The lawsuit, the SEC, the insurance mess. You made your point." I didn't correct him. It wasn't about making a point. He remained standing. I remained seated. "I'm here to discuss settlement," he continued. "You withdraw support for the minority claim, encourage de-escalation, publicly state that I acted in good faith. We close this out quietly." There it was. Transactional thinking. The assumption that everything bends if the right leverage is applied. "You're asking me to intervene in a shareholder lawsuit filed independently of the company," I said. "And to influence a federal inquiry. I'm asking you to stop pushing," he snapped. "I'm not pushing," I said. "The process is moving." He stepped closer to the desk. "You could end this." "No," I said calmly. I couldn't. Silence stretched between us. He tried a different angle. "You're interim CEO," he said. "Stability is your responsibility. Prolonged litigation hurts the company." I held his gaze. "What hurts the company?" I replied. "Is executives acting without authority?" His shoulders stiffened. "You think you're clean in this?" he asked. "You used governance as a weapon." "Governance isn't a weapon," I said. "It's a boundary." For the first time, his composure fractured. "You've ruined my career." I didn't raise my voice. "You terminated a majority shareholder under a title that didn't exist." I said, "The consequences aren't personal. They're structural." He laughed once. "Hollow. You could recommend mediation. I won't." Why? Because precedent matters. The word landed heavier than anything else we'd said. If a majority shareholder can be removed without consent, governance becomes theater. If an unratified executive can exercise authority without correction, structure dissolves. He leaned both hands on my desk. So that's it. You just watch me burn, I don't watch. I said quietly. I operate. For a second. Anger flashed across his face. Then something else calculation. My attorneys have options, he said. I'm sure they do. He straightened. You don't understand how far this could go. I do, I said. Better than you? He hesitated before leaving. Last chance, he said at the doorway. Call off the dogs. I didn't release them. I replied. The door closed harder than necessary. An hour later. Thomas called. Evan's legal team requested a private discussion. He said, not settlement. What kind preliminary exploration of Chapter 11 protection? I didn't answer immediately. Corporate bankruptcy isn't admission of guilt. It's an admission of unsustainable exposure. They're considering personal bankruptcy, I asked. Yes, Thomas said. If insurance denial stands and the damages estimate holds near $120 million, liquidity becomes impossible. There it was. The explosion wasn't loud. It was financial. Evan had believed power insulated him. Now he was contemplating court-supervised restructuring to survive litigation. I ended the call and looked around the office, the same office he'd toasted with champagne weeks earlier. Confrontation isn't about shouting. It's about refusing to interrupt the consequences someone else set in motion. He had accused me of sitting like I'd lost. What he never understood was that patience is not surrender. It's timing. And timing, when documented properly, always detonates at the right moment. Collapse rarely announces itself with a crash. It settles in increments, like dust after demolition. By the time Evan's legal team formally explored Chapter 11 protection, the narrative had shifted from dispute to inevitability. Insurance had upheld its denial of defense coverage, pending adjudication of unauthorized authority. Legal fees accumulated weekly. The minority shareholder suit advanced through discovery. The SEC inquiry continued quietly, methodically. Then came the asset disclosures. Evan listed his downtown condominium for sale, not publicly at first, off-market inquiries through private brokers. Within weeks, it appeared on the open listings. The asking price reflected urgency, not leverage. Court filings later confirmed what the market already suspected: liquidity was thinning. Legal obligations don't negotiate with reputation. Industry invitations disappeared entirely. Financial conferences withdrew speaking slots. Advisory boards quietly replaced his name. In governance circles, association risk spreads faster than formal sanction. The sanction came 3 months later, as part of a negotiated civil resolution tied to the shareholder litigation and regulatory findings. Evan agreed to a structured settlement without admitting intentional misconduct. He accepted a 5-year prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. 5 years in corporate governance is not a pause. It is exile. The announcement was brief, technical, no headlines this time. The spectacle phase had ended. What remained was documentation. The board convened again shortly afterward, this time for formal confirmation of leadership continuity. Thomas read the resolution clearly. Motion to appoint Maristine as Chief Executive Officer. Effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. I did not react outwardly. Stability requires composure. When the meeting adjourned, I remained seated while the others filtered out. The room felt quieter than it had during the ambush weeks earlier. Not tense, just settled. Power, when legitimate, doesn't vibrate. Later that afternoon, I signed the final governance amendment drafted during the cleanup phase. Anti-nepotism policy. It was precise. No executive appointment involving familial relationships to existing board members could occur without full independent director approval, public disclosure, and third-party review. Authority required documentation. Titles required votes. Influence required transparency. I signed my name without hesitation. Cold justice is procedural. It doesn't celebrate, it corrects. Before leaving the office that evening, I reviewed the updated shareholder structure summary. 58% majority ownership held through the trust. Voting control embedded in the charter. Board composition realigned. Independent governance committee installed. Then I reviewed a final document few would ever notice. An amendment to the bylaws acknowledging that any change to executive appointment authority required majority shareholder consent. Not interim consent. Not conditional consent. Majority consent. Ownership structures. When built patiently, create permanence. I didn't need to assert it publicly. The math did that for me, as dusk settled over the manufacturing district. I walked through the operations floor one last time that day. Machines ran steady. Supervisors logged output. No one stopped to congratulate me. They didn't need to. Predictability had returned. That was enough. Evan's name would linger in legal archives and governance case studies, not as a villain, not as a martyr, as a cautionary example of authority exercised without structure. My name would appear in filings and earnings calls, not as a conqueror, as a steward. Justice doesn't roar, it records. 5 years without eligibility to serve as an officer. Asset liquidation, settlement obligations, public documentation, and in contrast, a confirmed CEO appointment grounded in majority ownership and formal ratification. Before turning off the lights, I placed the signed anti-nepotism policy into the corporate records binder. Then I closed it. Collapse had completed its arc. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just final. And in the quiet that followed, the company felt less like a battleground and more like what it had always been to me, an asset I built. An asset I owned. An asset now governed exactly as it should be. Victory, when it's real, doesn't need an audience. A week after the final filings were processed and the governance amendments were sealed, facilities installed a new nameplate outside my office. They waited for my approval on the title engraving. Chief Executive Officer. I declined, instead. I asked for something simpler. Dean, no prefix, no hierarchy. Just the name that had been on pay stubs, factory hard hats, and purchase agreements for 24 years. When the plate was mounted, it didn't shimmer, it didn't announce authority, it felt accurate. That afternoon, I stood at the window overlooking the primary plant. Forklifts moved in measured lines. Steel shipments arrived on schedule. Production dashboards reflected steady output. No chaos, no spectacle, control. When earned, feels quiet. People occasionally ask if it was worth it, the public humiliation, the litigation, the months of scrutiny. I never answer theatrically. He thought I was legacy weight, turns out. I was the foundation, but even that line isn't something I say often. It doesn't need repetition. I don't replay the town hall in my head anymore. I don't revisit the Instagram post or the boardroom vote. Those moments served their function. They revealed structure. What remains is ownership. Not symbolic ownership, not emotional ownership, documented. Majority. Controlling ownership built quarter by quarter through an employee stock plan, private purchases, and patience, while others chased titles. I accumulated equity, while others performed leadership. I built it into the charter. Now, when I sign quarterly reports or approve capital expenditures, there's no adrenaline attached, just responsibility. I didn't win a war. I enforced alignment. And when I walk past the office door each morning and see Dean, I'm reminded that the most durable power isn't loud, inherited, or announced. It's held for 24 years. I quietly bought the company, today. I simply run what I already own. Power taught me something most people learn: too late titles are temporary. Ownership is permanent. I wasn't saved by anger, or by arguing louder, or by proving I was right in the moment. I was protected by preparation, by documents, by patience, by decisions made quietly for 24 years when no one was watching. That's the real lesson, not revenge, not drama, discipline. If you were in that ballroom publicly dismissed, underestimated, written off, what would you build in silence? Would you react? Or would you prepare? Would you chase validation? Or would you secure leverage? These are not emotional questions. They're structural ones. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Different cities, different time zones, different careers. But the same truth applies everywhere. Control what you can accumulate, not what you can announce. If this story made you think differently about your own position, your contracts, your investments, your long-term leverage, then don't keep that shift to yourself. Subscribe. Not for me. But so, stories like this reach someone who needs a reminder that patience is power. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and what you would have done. Like and share this with someone who feels underestimated right now. You might not realize it, but a single click from you can push this message towards someone standing in their own ballroom moment. And sometimes, that's how real change begins. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.